Monica said. You would soon fill them up if we allowed you to. That's my business to prevent, you know. I'm to protect you from your own restless energy, the inexhaustible sources of the power that wears out the machine, Lord Cleverton said. They've dried up, Monica, and you know it. They talk of rest, these doctors. Charles, they tell me to be cautious, to take life easy. Take life easily. It's like telling a man he mustn't run for trains, when the last thing he wants is to take a train for anywhere. No, I've not the slightest longing for the life I've led. Only fear of emptiness before me. If I had the energy to work myself to death, how gladly I would have faced death, but waiting, simply waiting, with no desire to act, yet a loathing of inaction, a fear of the vacuum, and no desire to fill it. It's just like sitting in an empty waiting room, in a railway station, on a branch line, after the last train, after all the other passengers have left, and the booking office is closed, and the porters have gone. What am I waiting for? In a cold and empty room, before an empty grate. For no one, for nothing, Monica says. Yet you've been looking forward to this very time. You know how you grumbled at the farewell banquet with the tributes from the staff, the presentation and the speech you had to make, and the speeches that you had to listen to. Lord Cleverton points to a silver salver still lying in its case and says, I don't know which impressed me more, the insincerity of what was said about me, or of my reply. All to thank them for that. Oh, the grudging contributions that brought this piece of silver, the inadequate levy that made the chairman's price, and my fellow directors saying we must put our hands in our pockets to double this collection. It must be something showy. This would do for visiting cards, if people still left cards. And if I was going to have any visitors, Monica says, Father, you simply want to revel in gloom. You know you've retired in a blaze of glory. You've read every word about you in the papers, Charles says, and the leading articles saying, we are confident that his sagacious counsel will long continue to be at the disposal of the government in power, and the expectation that your voice will be heard in debate in the upper house. Lord Cleverton says, the established liturgy of the press on any conspicuous retirement, my obituary, if I had died in harness, would have occupied a column and a half with an inset, a portrait taken 20 years ago. In 5 years' time, it will be the half of that. In 10 years' time, a paragraph. Charles says, that's the reward of every public man. Lord Cleverton says, say rather the exequies of the failed state's success. The successful failures who occupy positions that other men covet. When we go, a good many folk are mildly grieved. And our closest associates, the small minority of those who really understand the place we filled, are inwardly delighted. They won't want my ghost walking in the city or sitting in the Lord's. And I, who recognize myself as a ghost, shan't want to be seen there. It makes me smile to think that men should be frightened of ghosts, if they only knew how frightened a ghost can be of man, said Lord Cleverton. And there's a knock at the door, Lambert enters and says, "Excuse me, my lord. There's a gentleman downstairs. He's very insistent that he must see you. I told him he never saw anyone, my lord, but by previous appointment. He said he knew that, so he brought this note. He said that when you read it, you would want to see him. Said you'd be very angry if he heard that he'd gone away without your seeing him." Lord Claverton says, "What sort of a person?" Lambert says, "A foreign person, by the looks of him, but talks good English. A pleasant-spoken gentleman." Lord Claverton says, after reading the note, "I'll see him in the library. No, stop. I've left too many papers about there. I better see him here." Lambert says, "Very good, my lord. Shall I take the trolley, Miss Monica?" Monica says, "Yes, thank you, Lambert." And Lambert exits, and Charles says, "I ought to be going." Monica says, "Let us go into the library, and then I'll see you off." Lord Claverton says, "I'm sorry to turn you out of the room like this, but I have to see this man by myself, Monica. I've never heard of this Senor Gomez, but he comes with a letter of introduction from a man I used to know. I can't refuse to see him, though from what I remember of the man who introduces him, I expect he wants money, or to sell me something worthless." Monica says, "You ought not to bother with such people now, father. If you haven't got rid of him in 20 minutes, I'll send Lambert to tell you that you have to take a trunk call. Come, Charles, will you bring my coat?" Charles says, "I'll say goodbye, sir, and look forward to seeing you both at Batley Court in a week or two." Lambert enters and says, "Mr. Gomez, my lord." Lord Claverton says, "Goodbye, Charles, and please remember that we both want to see you whenever you can come. If you're in the vicinity, don't we, Monica?" Monica says, "Yes, father," and then and says to Charles, "We both want to see you." And Monica and Charles exits. Lambert shoos in Gomez. Lord Claverton says, "Good evening, Mr. Gomez. You're a friend of Mr. Culverwell." Gomez says, "We're as thick as thieves, you might say. Don't you know me, Dick?" Lord Claverton says, "Fred Culverwell. Why don't you come back with another name?" Gomez says, "You've changed your name too since I knew you. When we were up at Oxford, you were plain Dick Ferry, and then you married. You took your wife's name and became Mr. Richard Claverton Ferry. And finally, Lord Claverton, I've followed your example and done the same in a modest way. You know where I live, people do change their names. And besides, my wife's name is a good deal more normal in my country than Culverwell, and easier to pronounce," Lord Claverton says. "Have you lived out there ever since you left England?" "Ever since I finished my sentence." Lord Claverton says, "What brought you to England?" Gomez says, "Call it homesickness, curiosity, restlessness, whatever you like. But I've been a pretty hard worker all these years, and I thought, now's the time to take a long holiday. Let's say a rest cure. That's what I've come for. You see, I'm a widower, like you, Dick. So I'm pretty footloose. Gomez, you see, is now a highly respected citizen of a Central American republic, San Marco. It's as hard to become a respected citizen out there as it is here, with this qualification, that there they respect you for rather different reasons. I personally would oppose the idea of changing one's name, with marriage, or changing it without some sort of spiritual justification for changing outside of one's name that indicates parentage. Like the name means something that's not right or something. Lord Cliverton says, do you mean that you've won respect out there by the sort of activity that you lost respect here in England? Gomez says, not at all, not at all. I think that was rather an unkind suggestion. I've always kept on the right side of the law, and seen that the law turned its right side to me. Sometimes I've had to pay pretty heavily, but I learnt by experience whom to pay, and a little money laid out in the right manner, in the right places, pays many times over. I assure you it does. Lord Cliverton says, in other words, you've been engaged in systematic corruption. Gomez says, no, Dick. There's a fault in your logic. How can one corrupt those who are already corrupt? I can swear that I've never corrupted anybody. In fact, I've never come across an official innocent enough to be corruptible. Lord Cliverton says, it was seen that most of your business has been made of such a nature that if carried out in England, it might land you in gaol again. Gomez says, that's true enough, except for a false inference. I wouldn't dream of carrying on such business if I lived in England. I have the same standards of morality as the society in which I find myself. I do nothing in England that you would disapprove of, Lord Cliverton says. That's something at least to be thankful for. I trust you've no need to engage in forgery. Gomez says, forgery, Dick? An absurd suggestion. Forgery, I can tell you, is a mug's game. I say that with conviction. No, forgery, or washing checks, or anything of that nature, is certain to be found out sooner or later. And then what happens? You have to move on. That wouldn't do for me. I'm too domestic. And by the way, I've several children, all grown up, doing well for themselves. I wouldn't allow either of my sons to go into politics. In my country, Dick, politicians can't afford mistakes. The prudent ones always have an airplane ready and keep an account at a bank in Switzerland. The ones who don't get out in time find themselves in gaol and not very comfortable. Are for a firing squad. You don't know what serious politics is like. I said to my boys, never touch politics. Stay out of politics and play both parties. What don't you get from one, you may get from the other. Dick, don't tell me that there isn't any whiskey in the house. Now, if the politician is acting on principle, then that politician, really should be picking out the party that best serves his agenda at the particular time. But people talk like those countries are corrupt, but they hold their politicians accountable. Or at least they're willing to actually change the system rather than just pretend and say, more of this party got elected, or more of this party got elected, or this party is the party of the person who's in office, or, silly labels like that. Lord Cliverton says, I can provide whiskey. And he presses the bell. But why have you come? Gomez says, you've asked me that already. To see you, Dick, a natural desire. For you're the only old friend I can trust. Lord Cliverton says, you really trust me? I appreciate the compliment. Gomez says, which you're sure you deserve. But when I say trust, there's a knock and Lambert enters. And Lord Claverton says to Lambert, will you bring in the whiskey and soda? Lambert says, very good, my lord. Gomez says, and some ice. Lambert says, ice? Yes, my lord. And exits. Gomez says, I began to say, when I say trust, I use the term as experience has taught me. It's nonsense to talk of trusting people. In general, what does that mean? One trusts a man or a woman in this respect or that. A won't let me down in this relationship. B won't let me down in some other connection. But, as I've always said to my boys, when you come to the point where you need to trust someone, you must make it worth his while to be trustworthy. During this, Lambert enters silently, deposits tray and exit. Lord Claverton says, won't you help yourself? Gomez does so liberally. Gomez says, and what about you? Lord Claverton says, I don't take it, thank you. Gomez says, a reformed character. Lord Claverton says, I should like to know why you need to trust me. Gomez says, that's perfectly simple. I come back to England after 35 years. Can you imagine what it would be like to have been away from home for 35 years? I was 25, the same age as you, when I went away, thousands of miles away, to another climate, to another language, other standards of behavior, to fabricate for myself another personality, and to take another name. Think what that means, to take another name. He gets up and helps himself to whiskey. But of course, you know. Just enough to think you know more than you do. You've changed your name twice, by easy stages, and each step was merely a step up the ladder. So you weren't aware of becoming a different person. But where I changed my name, there was no social ladder. It was jumping a gap. And you can't jump back again. I parted from myself by a sudden effort. You, slowly and sweetly, that you've never woken up to the fact that Dick Ferry died long ago. I married a girl who didn't know a word of English, didn't want to learn English, wasn't interested in anything that happened 4,000 miles away, only believed what the parish priest told her. I made my children learn English. It's useful. I always talk to them in English. But do they think in English? No, they do not. They think in Spanish. But their thoughts are Indian thoughts. Oh God, Dick, you don't know what it's like to be so cut off. Homesickness. Homesickness is a sickly word. You don't understand such isolation as mine. You think you do, Lord Cleverson says. I'm sure I do. I've always been alone. Gomez says, oh, loneliness. Everybody knows what that's like. Your loneliness, so cozy, warm, and padded. You're not isolated, merely insulated. That's only when you come to see that you have lost yourself, that you are quite alone, Lord Claverton says. I'm waiting to hear why you should need to trust me. Gomez says, perfectly simple. My father's dead, long since. That's a good idea. A good thing. My mother, I dare say she's still alive, but she must be very old, and she must think I'm dead. And as for my married sisters, I don't suppose their husbands were ever told the story. They wouldn't want to see me. No, I need one old friend, a friend whom I can trust, and one who will accept both Culverwell and Gomez. See, Culverwell as Gomez, Gomez as Culverwell. I need you, Dick, to give me reality. Lord Claverton says, but, according to the description you have given of trusting people, how do you propose to make it worth my while to be trustworthy? Gomez says, it's done already, Dick. Done many years ago. Adoption tried and grappled to my soul with hoops of steel and all that sort of thing. We'll come to that very soon. Isn't it strange that there should always have been this bond between us? Lord Cleverton says, it has never crossed my mind to develop the point. Gomez says, well, consider what we were when we went up to Oxford. And then what I became under your influence. Lord Cleverton says, you cannot attribute your misfortune to my influence. Gomez says, I was just about as different as anyone could be from the sort of men you'd been at school with. I didn't fit into your set, and I knew it. When you started to take me up at Oxford, I've no doubt your friends wondered what you found in me. A scholarship boy from an unknown grammar school. I didn't know either, but I was flattered. Later I came to understand. You made friends with me because it flattered you, tickled your love of power to see that I was flattered and that I admired you. Everyone expected that I should get a first. I suppose your tutor thought you'd been sent down. It went the other way. You stayed the course, at least. I had plenty of time to think things over later, Lord Cleverton said. And what is the conclusion that you came to? Gomez says, this is how it worked out, Dick. You like to play the rake, but you never went too far. There's a prudent devil inside you, Dick. He never came to my help. Lord Cleverton says, I certainly admit no responsibility, none whatever, for what happened to you later. Gomez says, you led me on at Oxford, and left me to it. And so it came about that I was sent down. The consequences, which you remember. A miserable clerkship, which your father found for me, and expensive tastes, which you had fostered in me. And equally unfortunate, a talent for penmanship. Hence, as you have just reminded me, defalcation and forgery, and when my stretch, which gave me time to think it all out. Lord Cleverton, that's the second time you've mentioned your reflections. But there's just one thing you seem to have forgotten. I came to your assistance when you were released. Gomez says, yes, and paid my passage out. I know the reason. You wanted to get rid of me. I shall tell you why presently. Now let's look for a moment at your life history. You had plenty of money and made a good marriage. Or so it seemed. And with your father's money and your wife's family influences, you got on in politics. Shall we say that you did very well by yourself? Though not, I suspect, as well as you had hoped. Lord Cleverton says, I was never accused of making a mistake. Gomez says, no, in England mistakes are anonymous, because the man who accepts responsibility isn't the man who made the mistake. That's your convention. Or if it's known, you made it. You simply get moved to another post, or where at least you can't make quite the same mistake. At the worst, you go into opposition and let the other people make mistakes until your own have been more or less forgotten. I dare say you did make some mistake, Dick. That would account for your leaving politics and taking a conspicuous job in the city, where the government could always consult you. But of course, you didn't have to take your advice. I've made a point, you see, of following your career. Lord Cleverton says, I'm touched by your interest. Gomez says, I have a gift for friendship. I rejoiced in your success, but one thing has puzzled me. You were given a ministry before you were 50. That should have led you to the very top, and yet you withdrew from the world of politics and went into the city. Director of a bank and chairman of companies. You look the part. Cut out to be an impressive figurehead. But again, you've retired at 60. Why at 60? Lord Claverton said, knowing as much about me as you do, you must have read that I retired at the insistence of my doctors. Gomez says, oh yes, the usual euphemism. And yet I wonder, it is surprising. You should have been good for another 5 years at least. Why did they let you retire? Lord Claverton says, if you want to know, I had a stroke, and I might have another. Gomez says, yes, you might have another. But I wonder what brought about this stroke, and I wonder whether you're the great economist and financial wizard that you're supposed to be. And I've learned something of other vicissitudes. Dick, I was very, very sorry when I heard that your marriage had not been altogether happy. And as for your son, from what I've heard about him, he's followed your undergraduate career without the protection from that prudent devil of yours. And to tell him not to go too far, well, now I'm beginning to be thirsty again. And he pours himself whiskey. Of course, alcohol is not the best choice for quenching a person's thirst for a whole series of reasons. The thirst being part of that, because the alcohol itself is something that dries out, even though, people tend to drink less than half alcohol. I don't know what the thing is that most people drink, less than such percent. I don't know that sort of thing. But what you could call sinful consumption, the eating and drinking, the unlawful, is very, in the spiritual sense, leading cause of death in my country. Well, leading few causes of death. Where's the overdoses? Where's that rank? And by that I mean the hundreds of thousands of people who die short-term with alcohol too, not just long-term. But Lord Claverton says, an interesting historical epitome. Well, I mean, that many people get alcohol poisoning, but, Lord Claverton says, an interesting historical epitome, though I cannot accept it as altogether accurate. The only thing I find surprising is the respected citizen of San Marco is that, in the midst of the engrossing business of the nature of which dark hints have been given, he's informed himself so carefully about my career. Gomez says, I don't propose to give you a detailed account of my own career. I've been very successful. What would have happened to me, I wonder, if I had never met you? I should have got my first, and I might have become the history master in a school like that from which I went to Oxford. As is it, I'm somebody, a more important man in San Marco than I should ever have been in England. Lord Claverton says, and so you consider yourself a success? Gomez says, a worldly success in another sense. We're both of us failures, but even so, I'd rather be my kind of failure than yours. Lord Claverton says, and what do you call failure? Well, there's certainly psychological and spiritual failures, right? Gomez says, what do I call failure? The worst kind of failure, in my opinion, is the man who has to keep on pretending to himself that he's a success. The man who in the morning has to make up his face before he looks in the mirror. Lord Claverton says, isn't that the kind of pretense that you're maintaining in trying to persuade me of your worldly success? Gomez says, no, because I know the value of the coinage I pay myself in. Lord Claverton says, indeed, how interesting. I still don't know why you've come to see me, or what you mean by saying you can trust me. Gomez says, Dick, do you remember the moonlight night we drove back to Oxford You were driving, Lord Cliverton says. That happened several times. Gomez says, one time in particular. You know quite well to which occasion I'm referring. A summer night of moonlight and shadows. The night you ran over the old man of the road. Lord Cliverton says, you said I ran over an old man in the road. Gomez says, you knew it too. If you had been surprised when I said, Dick, you run over somebody, wouldn't you have shown it, if only for a second? You never lifted your foot from the accelerator. Lord Cliverton says, we were in a hurry. Gomez says, more than in a hurry. You didn't want it to be known where we'd been. The girls who were with us, what were their names? I've completely forgotten them. You didn't want them to be called to give evidence. You just couldn't face it. You do see now, Dick, why I say I can trust you. Lord Cliverton says, if you think that this story would interest the public, why not sell your version to a Sunday newspaper? Gomez says, my dear Dick, what a preposterous suggestion. Who's going to accept the unsupported statement of Federico Gomez of San Marco about something that happened so many years ago? What damages you'd get? The press wouldn't look at it. Besides, you can't think of any desire to appear in public as Frederick Culverwell. No, Dick, your secret's safe with me. Of course, I might give it to a few friends in confidence. It might even reach the ears of some of your acquaintance. But you'd never know to whom I'd told it, or who knew the story and who didn't. I promise you, rely upon me as the soul of discretion. Even when people have done bad things, don't blackmail them. Lord Cliverton says, what do you want then? Do you need money? Gomez says, my dear chap, you're obtuse. I said your secret is safe with me. And then I'd never have believed that you would accuse an old friend of blackmail. On the contrary, I dare say I could buy you out several times over. San Marco's a good place to make money in, though not to keep it in. My investments, not all in my own name either, are pretty well spread. For the matter of that, my current account in Stockholm or Zurich would keep me in comfort for the rest of my life. Really, Dick, you owe me an apology. Blackmail, on the contrary, any time you're in a tight corner, my entire resources are at your disposal. You were a generous friend to me once, as you pointedly reminded me of a moment later. Now it's my turn, perhaps, to do you a kindness. And Lambert enters.